The chamber went silent the moment the human ambassador stood up. I remember gripping the edge of my seat because something in the air had changed, and I could not explain why. My name is Vesic Thorn, and I have served on the Galactic Council for over 30 cycles as a senior attaché for the Vothari delegation. In all those cycles, I had never once seen a human delegate look the way Ambassador Nathaniel Cole looked that day. He did not shout, he did not argue, he simply placed a small data disk on the podium and said one sentence. Effective immediately, humanity withdraws from all diplomatic relations with the Galactic Council. Then he turned and walked out. For a long moment, nobody moved. The Dravith representative beside me let out a strange clicking sound, the kind his species makes when they are too shocked to speak. The Ulnari delegation, usually loud and argumentative, sat frozen in their seats. Even the council speaker, a towering Zelthan named Orvun Draith, seemed unable to find his voice. I looked around the chamber and saw hundreds of years of practiced diplomacy crumble in less than 10 seconds. You have to understand something about humans. When they first arrived at our doorstep, barely 200 cycles ago, they were desperate to be liked. They agreed to every regulation we imposed. They accepted trade terms that favored older species. They sat quietly through insults disguised as jokes. They took the worst seats in every summit, the smallest quotas in every resource agreement, and the least respect in every historical record. We called them the eager ones behind closed doors. Some species found it charming, others found it useful. I will admit, my own government found it convenient. When the announcement ended, chaos broke out. Delegates from a dozen species began shouting over each other, demanding explanations, demanding someone chase after the human ambassador and ask what this meant. The speaker called for order, but his voice cracked halfway through the sentence, and that told me everything about how unprepared we truly were. I did not shout. I sat there, replaying the ambassador's face in my mind. He had not looked angry. He had looked tired, the way a person looks after carrying something heavy for far too long and finally deciding to set it down. A message arrived on my personal console less than a minute later. It was from my superior, Councilwoman Ilsa Marinth, and it contained only 4 words. Find out what happened. I stood from my seat, my legs unsteady, and made my way toward the corridor where the human delegation's offices were located. Every step felt heavier than the last. Around me, other delegates were doing the same, moving in small clusters, whispering theories. Some believed this was a temporary protest, a dramatic gesture meant to win concessions in an upcoming trade vote. Others believed something far worse had happened, something we were not being told. When I reached the human embassy wing, I found the doors sealed, not locked in the ordinary sense, but sealed with a kind of finality that made my stomach tighten. The lights inside were dimmed. Personal belongings were already gone from the reception desks. It looked as though the humans had been preparing for this moment for a long time, quietly, without a single one of us noticing. I pressed the door chime anyway, though I already suspected no one would answer. To my surprise, the door slid open. Standing there was a young human woman named Grace Whitmore, one of the junior translators I had spoken with a handful of times over the cycles. She had always been polite, almost shy, the kind of person who apologized before you even finished a sentence. But the woman standing before me now held herself differently. Her shoulders were straight, her eyes were steady. I have nothing to tell you, Vesic, she said. I'm sorry. Grace, I said, please, this cannot be real. Talk to me. She paused, and for a moment I thought I saw the old her, the version who might have softened and explained everything just to avoid an uncomfortable silence. But she shook her head instead. I was told not to discuss anything, she said. I have my orders. Orders, I repeated. From whom? She did not answer. She simply stepped back and let the door close between us. I stood in that empty corridor for a long time, staring at the sealed entrance, feeling something I had not felt in decades of diplomatic service. I felt afraid, not of an enemy fleet or a hostile species, but of an absence. The humans had always been present, always available, always willing to bend. Now there was nothing but a closed door and a message I could not begin to understand. When I returned to the council chamber, the arguing had only grown louder. The representative from the Kathrani Banking Guild was demanding to know what would happen to the trade routes humans had been managing for the last 40 cycles. The Dravith military attaché was asking whether this meant humanity was preparing for open conflict. Someone else was already blaming the Vothari delegation, my own people, for pushing too hard during the last resource negotiation. I sat down heavily and looked toward the speaker's podium, waiting for someone, anyone, to offer real answers. But the speaker only stood there, his composure cracking further with every passing minute. That night, I could not sleep. I kept replaying old memories, small moments I had never thought twice about. I remembered a summit 2 cycles earlier where the human delegation had proposed a joint research initiative on deep space navigation, only to be told their contribution would be classified as a probationary trial, subject to review by 3 older species before any results could be shared galaxy-wide. I remembered how quietly they had accepted that ruling, how Ambassador Cole had simply nodded and said his government understood. I remembered thinking, at the time, that this was simply how humans were: patient, accommodating, easy to work with because they never pushed back. Now I wondered how many times we had mistaken patience for weakness. By morning, the council had called an emergency session. I arrived early, hoping to catch fragments of conversation before the formal proceedings began. The chamber buzzed with anxious energy. Screens along the walls displayed reports flooding in from outer colonies, all carrying the same troubling theme. Human logistics ships, the ones responsible for moving critical supplies between star systems, had gone dark. Human medical relief teams stationed on 3 different colony worlds had been quietly recalled overnight. Human translators working within our own embassies, like Grace Whitmore, had resigned en masse. It was as though an entire section of the galaxy's infrastructure had simply vanished, all at once, without warning. I found a seat near the back of the chamber, next to an old colleague named Ferris Adeline, a research liaison from the Ulnari homeworld. She looked pale, her feathers pressed flat against her skull in a posture I recognized as deep distress. "Have you seen the reports from the Outer Rim?" she asked me quietly. "I have," I said. 3 colonies are without emergency medical support," she continued. "Human volunteers were running nearly all of it, Vesic." I did not respond right away. I was thinking about how casually we had always referred to human contributions as supplementary, as though they were simply filling gaps left by more important species. I was beginning to understand, with a sinking feeling in my chest, that the gaps had always been filled by them, and the rest of us had simply never noticed because they never demanded credit. The speaker called the session to order, and the chamber slowly quieted. He looked exhausted, as though he too had not slept. "Delegates," he began, his voice unsteady, "we find ourselves in an unprecedented situation. The human delegation has formally withdrawn from all diplomatic engagement with this council. All treaties are considered suspended from their side. All joint operations have been halted. We do not yet have an official explanation for this action." A ripple of murmurs spread across the chamber. "What we do know," the speaker continued, "is that the consequences are already severe. Reports indicate disruptions to supply chains, medical services, and communication relay networks across multiple sectors. We are working to understand the full scope of human involvement in these systems." Someone from the back of the chamber called out, demanding to know why no one had understood the scope of human involvement before this moment. The speaker had no answer. Neither did I. I sat there, listening to the arguments swirl around me, and I thought about Ambassador Cole's face as he set that data disk on the podium. He had not looked like a man declaring victory. He had looked like a man who had simply run out of patience, quietly, after years of being told his people did not matter enough to be treated as equals. I thought about my own government's votes over the cycles, the times we had supported measures that diminished human standing simply because it was convenient, because humans never complained, because it was easier to overlook a species that refused to make a scene. I began to wonder, sitting in that chamber full of panic and blame, whether we had built our entire system on the quiet labor of a people we never bothered to respect. And I wondered what it would take to earn their trust again, if such a thing was even possible anymore. The session ended without resolution. Delegates filed out in tense silence, already forming private alliances, already searching for someone to blame. I stayed behind for a while, staring at the empty podium where Ambassador Cole had once stood, delivering a single sentence that had shattered decades of careful diplomatic pretense. I did not yet know what humanity intended to do next. I did not know whether this silence would last for days or for generations. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that the galaxy I had known before that morning no longer existed. Something had shifted, quietly and permanently, and none of us had seen it coming until it was already too late to stop. As I walked back toward my quarters that night, I passed the sealed human embassy once more. The lights remained off, the door remained closed, and somewhere beyond it, I imagined an entire species preparing for a future that no longer required our approval, our permission, or our presence at all. I did not wait for the council to assign me a task. I decided, on my own, that I needed to understand what had truly happened, so I went looking through every archive I had access to, searching for the moment when patience had finally broken. Councilwoman Marinth granted me access to the full diplomatic record, every transcript, every vote, every private memo exchanged between delegations over the last 50 cycles. She wanted answers as badly as I did, though I suspected her reasons were less about understanding humanity and more about protecting the Vothari from blame. I began with the earliest records, back when humans first requested membership in the council. Their initial application had been met with suspicion. Many species argued that humanity was too young, too unpredictable, too aggressive in their own history to be trusted with equal standing. A compromise was reached instead. Humanity would be granted what the council called probationary status, a temporary classification meant to last no more than 10 cycles while their conduct was observed. That probationary status never ended. Cycle after cycle, review after review, some new justification appeared to extend it. I found records of votes where older species argued that humans had not yet demonstrated sufficient technological maturity, even as human engineers quietly solved problems that had stumped council scientists for generations. I found records where humans were denied full voting rights on resource allocation, even as they contributed enormous shares of relief supplies to struggling colonies. I remember pausing on one particular transcript for a long time. It was from a summit 40 cycles ago, where a human representative named Daniel Ashford proposed a formal review of the probationary classification, arguing that humanity had more than proven itself. The response from the council floor was almost dismissive. A senior Dravith counselor suggested that humanity's proposal be tabled indefinitely, citing the need for further observation. The motion passed with only minor objection. Daniel Ashford's response, recorded plainly in the transcript, was simply, "Understood. We will continue our work." I found dozens of similar moments scattered across the decades. Requests quietly denied, contributions quietly minimized, achievements attributed to joint effort even when human teams had done nearly all the work alone. And through every single one of these moments, the human response remained the same. Patient acceptance, continued cooperation, never a raised voice, never a formal complaint, never a threat. I began to feel sick as the pattern grew clearer. We had not simply overlooked humanity. We had built an entire system that relied on their willingness to be overlooked. I brought my findings to Ferris Adeline the following day, hoping she might help me make sense of what I had uncovered. She read through the documents in silence, her feathers slowly flattening against her scalp as she absorbed each new example. "This is worse than I imagined," she finally said. "We treated them as a permanent trial run, decades of contribution, and we never once considered granting them what every other member species received automatically." "Why did no one object?" I asked. "Surely someone on the council must have noticed this pattern before now." Ferris looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her before, something between shame and exhaustion. "Some of us did notice," she admitted quietly. "I raised concerns myself, years ago, During a resource allocation vote, I was told the matter was already settled and that reopening it would create unnecessary friction with the older delegations. I let it go, Vesic. I told myself it was not my place to fight that battle. I imagine many others told themselves the same thing. Her honesty struck me harder than any official report could have. It was not simply that the Council had wronged humanity through deliberate cruelty. It was something quieter and more troubling than that. It was neglect born from convenience, sustained by silence, and reinforced by an entire species that never gave us a reason to feel guilty about it. I continued digging through the archives over the following days, and the deeper I went, the more disturbing the pattern became. I found records of human scientists whose breakthroughs were folded into joint council publications without proper individual credit. I found trade agreements where human colonies were assigned smaller resource quotas than newer member species with a fraction of their population. I found operational logs where human defense fleets were called upon repeatedly to respond to emergencies in other species' territories, often at great cost to their own readiness, with little acknowledgement offered in return. One record in particular stayed with me. 6 cycles ago, a human relief fleet responded to a catastrophic reactor failure on a mining colony belonging to another species. Nearly 300 human crew members worked around the clock for 11 days to prevent a total ecological collapse of the system. Losses were severe on the human side. When the crisis ended, the official council report credited the successful resolution to a coordinated multi-species response, without naming a single human contributor directly. I searched for any formal acknowledgement ever issued to the human government for that operation. I found none. I brought this particular record to Councilwoman Marinth, hoping it might shake something loose in her, some sense of accountability. She read through it carefully, her expression unreadable for a long moment. "This is troubling," she finally said, "but I need you to understand something, Vesic. The Council operates on precedent. Once a pattern of behavior becomes normalized, it becomes very difficult to reverse, without admitting fault on a massive scale. No delegation wants to be the first to admit they benefited from this arrangement. Then perhaps it is time someone did," I said. She looked at me carefully, as though weighing how much honesty she could afford to share. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "but you must understand that admitting fault will not be enough to bring them back. Humanity did not withdraw because they wanted an apology, Vesic. I believe they withdrew because they finally understood that an apology would never be enough on its own. They wanted real change, and we gave them decades of polite dismissal instead." Her words settled over me like a heavy weight. I began to understand that this was not simply a diplomatic crisis to be managed through the right combination of gestures and promises. This was the result of a slow, grinding erosion of trust, built through thousands of small decisions made by delegations who told themselves each individual choice was reasonable, even as the cumulative effect crushed an entire people's patience. I decided to speak with someone from the human side directly, hoping to find any thread of understanding I could bring back to the council. Grace Whitmore had refused to speak with me before, but I hoped that with time, perhaps she would reconsider. I returned to the sealed embassy wing and found it even quieter than before. Most of the human staff had already departed the station entirely, boarding transport vessels bound for destinations the council had not been informed of. Only a skeleton crew remained, tasked with finalizing the closure of the embassy itself. To my surprise, Grace agreed to meet with me, though she insisted the conversation remain informal. We sat in a small lounge near the embassy's entrance, the same lounge where I had once shared casual conversations with human staff during quieter diplomatic seasons. The furniture remained, but the warmth that once filled the room had disappeared entirely. "I need you to understand something, Vesic," Grace said, her voice steady but quiet. "This was not a sudden decision. I have worked for the Human Diplomatic Corps for nearly 9 cycles. I have watched delegation after delegation absorb insult after insult, always advised by our own leadership to remain calm, to keep working, to trust that patience would eventually be rewarded with respect. I did not know how to fully understand that," I admitted. She nodded slowly. "I did not expect you to, not completely, but I can tell you this much. The decision to withdraw was not made in anger. It was made after a long, careful assessment of what continued engagement was costing us, and what continued silence from your side told us about how little our patience actually mattered. I asked her, gently, whether there was any possibility of reconciliation, any path that might lead humanity back to the negotiating table. Grace considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I cannot speak for my government's official position," she said, "but I can tell you that reconciliation, if it happens, will not come from another round of promises. It will only come if the Council demonstrates, through actions rather than words, that it understands what it did wrong. And I suspect that will take far longer than anyone in that chamber is prepared to accept." Her words echoed in my mind long after our conversation ended. I returned to my quarters that night and sat alone for hours, reviewing everything I had gathered. The pattern was undeniable, the excuses were exhausted, and the silence from humanity, once dismissed as simple patience, now felt like the calm before an entirely new chapter neither I nor anyone else on the council was prepared to face. I began drafting a report for Councilwoman Marinth, though I already suspected it would not be well received by the wider council. I documented every case of dismissed contribution, every denied review, every quiet erasure of human effort from official record. I included Grace's words, carefully paraphrased to respect her request for privacy, along with a final assessment of my own. I wrote that humanity's withdrawal was not an isolated reaction to a single event, but the natural result of decades of accumulated neglect. I wrote that the Council could not expect an easy resolution, nor should it seek one. I wrote that if any hope remained of restoring the relationship, it would require the Council to confront uncomfortable truths about its own conduct, truths many delegations would prefer to avoid entirely. I submitted the report the following morning, uncertain whether anyone would take it seriously. But as I walked back through the quiet corridors of the station, past the sealed embassy and its darkened windows, I understood that regardless of how the Council responded, something fundamental had already changed. The species we had once treated as eager and expendable had quietly built an entire foundation beneath our feet, and now, for the first time, we were beginning to feel what it meant to stand without it. 3 days after humanity's withdrawal, the first colony went completely dark. It was a mid-sized settlement called Perrin Hollow, home to nearly 200,000 Kethrani citizens, situated on the edge of a system with harsh radiation storms that made long-range communication difficult without a stable relay network. That relay network, I soon learned, had been built, maintained, and operated almost entirely by a small team of human engineers stationed there under a decades-old service agreement. When the human government issued its recall order, those engineers packed their equipment and left within 48 hours. No backup system had ever been established because no one had ever considered it necessary. The humans had always been there, quietly keeping the signal alive, and nobody thought to ask what would happen if they stopped. The moment they left, Perrin Hollow vanished from every communication channel in the sector. I learned about this crisis during an emergency briefing called by Councilwoman Marinth, attended by representatives from nearly every major delegation. The room was tense, filled with the kind of nervous energy that comes when people realize a disaster is unfolding faster than anyone can respond to it. "We have lost all contact with Perrin Hollow," announced a Kethrani officer named Director Osric Vale, his voice tight with controlled panic. "We do not know if the colony is safe. We do not know if the radiation shielding is holding. We have no way to reach them until we can restore some form of relay function, and our engineers tell us that could take months." "Months," someone repeated in disbelief. "The relay towers were designed using proprietary human calibration methods," Director Vale continued. "Our own technicians can operate basic functions, but the deep space signal boosting relies on a system only a handful of human specialists ever fully understood. We assumed the knowledge had been shared broadly enough to manage without them. We were wrong." I sat there absorbing this information, feeling a chill spread through me as I realized how widespread this problem likely was. If a single colony's communication network depended so completely on human expertise, how many other systems across the galaxy shared the same hidden vulnerability? The answer, as it turned out, was nearly all of them. Over the following days, reports flooded into the council chamber from every direction, each one more alarming than the last. A Dravith shipping consortium reported that nearly 60% of their interstellar cargo routes had been coordinated through logistics software, maintained by a small human firm that had abruptly ceased operations. Without that software, cargo ships were left drifting between waypoints, unable to calculate efficient paths through hazardous debris fields that had once been mapped and updated constantly by human analysts. A medical alliance representing several smaller species reported that emergency response teams stationed across a dozen border worlds had been almost entirely staffed by human volunteers, trained specifically to handle the kind of rapid triage situations that arose during industrial accidents and natural disasters. With those volunteers gone, entire regions were left without any coordinated emergency response capability whatsoever. Even our own translation networks, the systems that allowed hundreds of different species to communicate smoothly during council sessions, had been quietly maintained by human linguists who had developed adaptive algorithms far more advanced than anything the rest of us had managed to build ourselves. Without their ongoing maintenance, translation errors began appearing almost immediately, causing confusion and frustration in every diplomatic exchange that still remained active. I remember sitting through one particularly tense session where a Dravith delegate attempted to address an Ulnari counterpart, only for the automated translation system to render his carefully worded diplomatic message into something nonsensical and mildly insulting. The Ulnari delegate stood up in outrage, believing he had been deliberately disrespected, and it took nearly 20 minutes of frantic clarification to calm the situation. It was a small moment, but it captured something larger. The invisible scaffolding humans had built beneath our entire civilization was collapsing piece by piece, and every single failure revealed just how much we had relied on them without ever acknowledging it. I began compiling a comprehensive assessment for Councilwoman Marinth, cataloging every system that depended on human involvement. The list grew longer each day. Deep space navigation calibration, emergency medical response coordination, agricultural distribution networks feeding several resource-poor colonies, structural engineering oversight for aging space stations built decades earlier using outdated materials, cybersecurity protocols protecting financial systems from increasingly sophisticated attacks. The pattern was consistent everywhere. Humans had never demanded recognition for this work. They had simply done it, quietly and efficiently, filling gaps that other species either could not or would not fill themselves. And because they never complained, because they never used their contributions as leverage in negotiations, the rest of us had simply assumed their work was ordinary, easily replaceable, hardly worth acknowledging. Now, with their sudden absence, we were discovering just how wrong that assumption had been. I visited Director Vale's office one afternoon, hoping to learn more about the situation at Perrin Hollow. He looked exhausted, dark circles beneath his eyes, his usually composed demeanor replaced by visible strain. "Any progress?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "Our engineers are attempting to reverse engineer the calibration protocols, but the human systems were built with a level of precision our own training never fully covered. We assumed we understood enough to manage in an emergency. We were wrong. Every attempt to restore the relay introduces new signal distortions that could be dangerous if amplified incorrectly." "Is there any way to reach the human government directly?" I asked. Surely, in a matter of colony safety, they would consider some form of limited assistance. "We tried," Director Vale admitted. "Our formal request for emergency technical support was returned unanswered. Not rejected, simply unanswered. I do not know if that means they are ignoring us, or if their withdrawal is truly as absolute as it appears." His words unsettled me deeply. A silence that offered neither acceptance nor rejection felt somehow worse than an outright refusal. It suggested a discipline, a resolve, that none of us had anticipated from a species we had always assumed craved our approval. I left his office and wandered the station corridors for a while, trying to process the scale of what was unfolding. Around me, other delegates moved with the same anxious energy, whispered conversations trailing behind them, each one carrying fragments of new crises emerging across the galaxy. I passed a public viewing screen displaying a live feed from a council-owned news outlet, reporting on the situation. The anchor, a composed Zelthan newscaster, was interviewing a panel of economic analysts about the sudden disruption to interstellar trade routes. Preliminary estimates suggest that nearly 30% of all interstellar commerce relied, in some capacity, on infrastructure either built or maintained by human specialists, one analyst explained. This includes logistics coordination, navigational safety systems, and financial transaction security protocols. The full economic impact of this withdrawal may not be understood for several more cycles. Another analyst added, "What is perhaps most troubling is how invisible this dependency was until now. Humanity never used this leverage during negotiations. They simply did the work, year after year, without ever threatening to withhold it as a bargaining tool. Their withdrawal appears to be a genuine departure, not a negotiating tactic." I stood there listening, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and something close to admiration. Humanity had held immense leverage over the entire galactic community for decades and had never once used it to force better treatment. They had simply worked, quietly, patiently, allowing themselves to be undervalued because they believed, perhaps, that eventually their contributions would be recognized on their own merit. Instead, we had taken their patience as confirmation that they did not require recognition at all. That evening, I received an urgent summons to a closed session of senior council staff, restricted to those directly involved in crisis assessment. When I arrived, the mood in the room was grim. Councilwoman Marinth stood at the head of the table, her expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "We have received updated reports from 17 additional colonies experiencing severe disruption," she said without preamble. 3 have declared formal states of emergency. Structural failures have been reported on 2 aging space stations previously monitored under human engineering oversight. We are now facing the possibility of civilian casualties if these systems are not restored quickly. A murmur of concern spread through the room. "What are our options?" someone asked. Councilwoman Marinth hesitated before answering. "Limited," she admitted. "We can attempt emergency repairs using our own specialists, though as Director Vale has already demonstrated, our understanding of these systems is incomplete. We can attempt to negotiate limited technical assistance from the human government, though our previous request went unanswered. Or we can accept that certain systems will fail and prepare to manage the humanitarian consequences as best we can." The silence that followed was heavier than any I had experienced since the crisis began. I thought about Ambassador Cole's calm departure from the chamber, the simple sentence he had delivered before walking away. I thought about Grace Whitmore's steady voice explaining that reconciliation would require more than promises. I thought about decades of quiet contribution, dismissed and diminished, finally reaching its breaking point. We had built an entire civilization on a foundation we never bothered to examine closely, assuming it would always hold, assuming the people maintaining it would never simply walk away. Now, faced with the consequences of that assumption, I understood that the coming cycles would test not only our infrastructure, but our willingness to finally confront what we had done and what it might take to build something better in its place. The emergency session that followed the Perrin Hollow crisis was unlike anything I had witnessed in my 30 cycles of service. Delegates who once maintained careful diplomatic composure now spoke over one another, their voices sharp with accusation and fear. The Dravith military attaché stood first, his broad shoulders squared in a posture I recognized as preparation for confrontation. "We are being held hostage," he declared loudly. "Humanity has weaponized their own absence against the entire council. This cannot be tolerated. I propose we consider a formal demand, backed by military presence if necessary, requiring their immediate return to full diplomatic engagement." Several delegates murmured in agreement, though I noticed others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. I stood before I had fully decided to speak, my voice carrying further than I expected in the tense chamber. With respect, I said, that proposal would be a catastrophic mistake. The Dravith attaché turned toward me, his expression sharpening. Explain yourself, Attaché Thorn. I gestured toward the reports still displayed across the chamber screens. The endless list of failing systems, collapsing infrastructure, colonies teetering on the edge of crisis. We have just spent the last several days discovering how deeply humanity's quiet contributions supported nearly every function of our civilization, I said. Logistics, medical response, communication relays, financial security. And they built all of this without ever using it as leverage against us, without ever threatening withdrawal as a negotiating tactic. If a species with that level of capability chose to walk away peacefully rather than escalate, I believe it would be catastrophic to assume they lack the capability to respond decisively if we attempt to force their hand through military pressure. The chamber fell into an uneasy silence. You believe they are hiding something? The Dravith attaché asked, his tone slightly less certain than before. I believe, I said carefully, that we have consistently underestimated humanity throughout our entire history of contact. I believe threatening a species capable of building systems this sophisticated, this deeply embedded, without ever revealing the full extent of their capability, would be an extraordinarily dangerous gamble. Councilwoman Marinth stepped forward before further arguments could erupt. Attaché Thorn raises a valid concern, she said. Before any consideration of coercive measures, I propose we send a limited diplomatic delegation, unofficial in nature, to assess the human government's current disposition and determine whether any path toward renewed dialogue remains open. The proposal sparked further debate, but eventually, after nearly 2 hours of heated discussion, the Council agreed to authorize a small delegation. To my surprise and considerable unease, Councilwoman Marinth selected me to lead it. You understand their history better than most of us at this point, she told me privately afterward, and you have already established some rapport with members of their diplomatic staff. I need someone who can approach this without hostility, Vesic, someone who might actually listen. I accepted the assignment, though I felt the weight of it settle heavily across my shoulders. 2 additional delegates were assigned to accompany me. Ferris Adeline, whose honesty during our earlier conversation had earned my trust, and a quiet Zelthan logistics specialist named Calder Reyes, who had recently joined the council staff and possessed a calm, measured temperament I hoped would serve us well. Our journey to the coordinates provided by the last known human transmission took several days. During that time, I reviewed every piece of information I had gathered, preparing myself for whatever reception awaited us. I did not know whether we would be welcomed, ignored, or turned away entirely. When our ship finally arrived at the designated system, what I saw left me speechless. The human colony we approached, a settlement known as New Ashcombe, had transformed dramatically since the last survey conducted by Council observers years earlier. Defensive satellite networks surrounded the system in a pattern far more sophisticated than anything documented in our records. Automated monitoring stations tracked our approach with a precision that suggested advanced sensor technology well beyond what humanity had previously demonstrated to outside observers. They knew we were coming before we even transmitted our arrival codes, Calder Reyes observed quietly, studying the readings on our ship's console. This level of detection capability was never part of any technology they shared with the Council. Ferris Adeline stared out at the defensive formations with an expression of quiet astonishment. They have been preparing for this moment for a long time, she said. This is not something built in the last few days. This required years of quiet development. I felt a cold understanding settle over me. Humanity had not simply reacted impulsively to accumulated frustration. They had spent years, perhaps decades, quietly preparing for the possibility that they might need to stand entirely on their own, without relying on the Council's protection or approval. Our ship was guided through a series of automated checkpoints, each one processing our credentials with mechanical efficiency, offering no verbal communication beyond confirmation of clearance. Eventually, we were directed to a landing platform on the surface of New Ashcombe itself. The colony below looked nothing like the modest settlements I remembered from earlier surveys. Structures had expanded significantly, incorporating advanced architectural designs that suggested substantial technological growth. Agricultural domes stretched across the landscape in efficient, self-sustaining patterns. Manufacturing facilities hummed with quiet, controlled activity. We were met upon landing by a small reception team, led by a composed woman who introduced herself as Director Elena Wordsworth, a senior official within humanity's newly restructured Foreign Affairs Office. "Welcome to New Ashcombe," she said, her tone polite but carefully measured. "I understand you have requested this meeting to discuss the current state of relations between our government and the Council." "That is correct," I said. "We hope to better understand humanity's position and to explore whether any path toward renewed dialogue might exist." Director Wordsworth studied us for a long moment before responding. "I can arrange a meeting with a representative capable of discussing that matter directly," she said. "However, I must be clear that this visit does not constitute a resumption of formal diplomatic relations. We remain firm in our decision to withdraw from the Council's current structure. This meeting is exploratory only." "Understood," I said. She led us through the colony toward a modest administrative building, and along the way, I could not help but notice the quiet efficiency surrounding us. Automated systems handled logistics tasks that would have required extensive staffing on most Council worlds. Public infrastructure appeared meticulously maintained, without the visible strain I had grown accustomed to seeing on colonies still dependent on external support. This civilization did not appear weakened by their withdrawal from Council structures. If anything, it appeared to be thriving under its newfound independence. As we walked, Ferris leaned toward me and spoke quietly. "I do not think we came here to convince them of anything," she murmured. "I think we came here to understand exactly how far behind we truly are." Her words settled uncomfortably in my chest, because I suspected she was right. We were led into a quiet conference room, sparsely furnished but efficiently organized. Director Wordsworth informed us that we would be meeting with a senior representative shortly and then left us alone to wait. The minutes stretched on in tense silence. Calder Reyes reviewed his notes quietly, while Ferris stared out a nearby window at the organized activity happening across the colony grounds. I found myself thinking back to Ambassador Cole's calm departure from the Council chamber, wondering what kind of leadership had guided humanity through such a disciplined, deliberate transition away from dependence on external validation. Eventually, the door opened, and a figure entered whose calm, steady presence immediately commanded the room's attention. I straightened in my seat, uncertain exactly what to expect, but understanding, with quiet certainty, that whatever came next would determine far more than the outcome of this single meeting. It would determine whether the fractured relationship between humanity and the wider galaxy could ever be repaired, or whether we had already lost something too valuable to ever fully recover. The man who entered the room was not Ambassador Cole, though something in his bearing reminded me of him immediately. He was tall, perhaps in his middle years, with a calm expression that carried none of the anger I had expected. He introduced himself simply as Julian Ferris, Senior Counselor to humanity's newly formed Foreign Relations Directorate. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us," I said, rising from my seat along with Ferris and Calder. Julian gestured for us to sit and took a seat across from us, folding his hands calmly on the table. "I want to be direct with you from the beginning," he said. "This meeting exists because Director Wordsworth believed it was worth understanding what the Council hoped to achieve by sending a delegation. It does not exist because our government has reconsidered its withdrawal." "I appreciate your honesty," I said. "I will offer the same. I was sent to better understand what led to this decision, and whether any circumstances might allow for renewed dialogue in the future." Julian studied me for a long moment before responding. "I think it would help if I explained something first," he said. "For nearly 200 cycles, humanity approached the Council with a simple hope. We wanted to belong. We wanted to contribute meaningfully to a larger community, and we believed that if we worked hard enough, remained patient enough, and avoided unnecessary conflict, we would eventually be treated as equals." I did not respond, allowing him to continue. Instead, he said, we discovered that our patience was interpreted as weakness. Our contributions were treated as expected, rather than valued. Every attempt to formalize equal standing was delayed, deferred, or quietly buried under procedural excuses. We accepted this for a very long time, because we believed that eventually, persistence would be rewarded. What changed? Ferris asked quietly. Julian's expression remained calm, though something in his eyes carried a quiet weight. We stopped believing persistence alone would ever be enough, he said. We realized that the council's structure was not designed to recognize contributions unless those contributions came with leverage attached. So we made a decision. Rather than continue demanding recognition we would never receive, we chose to build something entirely our own, something that did not depend on anyone else's approval to succeed. I thought about the defensive networks surrounding this system, the efficient infrastructure spread across the colony grounds, the calm confidence carried by every human official we had encountered since our arrival. You were preparing for this for a long time, I said. Julian nodded. Longer than you likely realize. We began quietly reducing our dependence on council structures nearly 15 cycles ago, redirecting resources towards self-sufficient systems, developing our own technological capabilities without relying on shared council research initiatives that consistently minimized our contributions. By the time Ambassador Cole delivered our withdrawal announcement, the decision had already been finalized internally for nearly 2 years. I felt a strange mixture of admiration and unease settle over me. Humanity had not acted impulsively, nor had they acted out of sudden anger. They had made a calculated, patient decision, executed with the same quiet discipline that had defined their behavior throughout their entire history with the Council. May I ask, I said carefully, what would need to happen for humanity to consider renewed engagement with the Council in the future? Julian considered the question thoughtfully before answering. I can offer you our government's position, though I want to be clear this reflects a broader consensus, not simply my own opinion, he said. We are not interested in returning to a relationship built on probationary status, delayed recognition, or contributions treated as background labor rather than genuine partnership. If the Council wishes to engage with humanity in the future, it must be prepared to treat us as full equals from the outset, without conditions, without extended observation periods, and without minimizing our role in any joint effort. That is a significant demand, Calder Reyes said quietly. It is a reasonable one, Julian replied evenly. We are not asking for special treatment. We are asking for the same standing every other species in the Council received, without needing to prove themselves repeatedly over 2 centuries. I nodded slowly, absorbing his words. I understand your position, I said. I cannot promise the Council will accept these terms easily. There are delegations who benefited significantly from the current structure, and convincing them to relinquish that advantage will not happen quickly. Julian's expression remained steady. I understand that as well, he said, and I want you to understand something in return. We are not in a hurry. Our colonies are stable. Our infrastructure is self-sufficient. Our economy no longer depends on Council trade agreements to sustain itself. We can wait as long as necessary for the Council to decide whether genuine partnership matters more than preserved advantage. His words carried no threat, no anger, simply a calm statement of fact. And somehow, that calm certainty unsettled me more deeply than any display of aggression could have. I asked him gently whether humanity harbored resentment toward the Council for the decades of dismissive treatment they had endured. Julian paused for a long moment before answering, his expression softening slightly. Resentment implies we expected better and were disappointed, he said. I think honestly, many of us stopped expecting better a long time ago. What we feel now is closer to clarity. We understand our own worth. We understand what genuine partnership requires, and we are no longer willing to accept less than that, regardless of how comfortable it might be for everyone else involved. I sat with his words for a long moment, feeling the full weight of what they represented. This was not a species driven by anger, seeking punishment or revenge for past treatment. This was a species that had simply, quietly, decided they deserved better, and had built the means to secure that better future entirely on their own terms. Before our meeting concluded, I asked Julian one final question, one that had been weighing on me since Ambassador Cole's departure from the council chamber. "Do you believe reconciliation is possible?" I asked. "Not today, perhaps not soon, but eventually." Julian considered the question carefully. "I believe most things are possible given enough time and enough genuine effort," he said. "But I want to be honest with you, Attaché Thorn. Reconciliation cannot be rushed simply because the Council is uncomfortable with the consequences of our absence. If the Council genuinely wishes to build a better relationship with humanity in the future, it must be willing to demonstrate that commitment through consistent action over time, not through a single gesture meant to quickly resolve an uncomfortable crisis." I nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in his words, even as I felt the weight of how difficult that path would be to walk. Our meeting concluded shortly afterward, and Director Wordsworth escorted us back toward our ship. As we walked through the colony grounds one final time, I found myself studying the calm efficiency surrounding us, the quiet confidence carried by every human official and worker we passed. Before we boarded our vessel, Grace Whitmore appeared unexpectedly at the edge of the landing platform. I had not known she would be present at New Ashcombe, and seeing her familiar face brought a small measure of comfort amid the uncertainty of our visit. "I wanted to see you off," she said simply. "Thank you, Grace," I said. "I appreciated your honesty during our previous conversation. It helped me understand more than any official record could have." She offered a small, genuine smile. "I am glad it helped," she said. "I know this has been difficult for you, Vesic. I want you to know that I do not believe humanity closed this door out of cruelty. We closed it because we finally understood that leaving it open indefinitely was only allowing the same patterns to continue. I understand that now," I said quietly. "I only hope the Council can find the wisdom to respond appropriately, even if it takes considerable time to do so." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "I hope so as well," she said. "Humanity did not want to stand apart from the galaxy forever. We simply needed to remind everyone, including ourselves, that our patience was never a resource to be endlessly exploited without consequence." As our ship departed New Ashcombe and the colony shrank into the distance behind us, I found myself reflecting on everything I had witnessed during this brief but transformative journey. Humanity had not descended into conflict, nor had they sought retribution for decades of dismissive treatment. Instead, they had quietly built an entirely self-sufficient future, calmly demonstrating that their contributions had never truly depended on the Council's recognition to hold value. When we returned to the Council chamber to deliver our report, I stood before the assembled delegations and shared everything we had learned. I described the disciplined, deliberate nature of humanity's withdrawal. I described the advanced infrastructure and defensive capabilities they had quietly developed over years of preparation. I described Julian Ferris's calm, unwavering terms for any future engagement, terms that demanded genuine equality rather than continued probationary status. The chamber remained largely silent as I spoke, though I noticed several delegations exchanging uneasy glances throughout my report. When I finished, Councilwoman Maranth rose slowly from her seat. "This council now faces a choice unlike any we have encountered before," she said. "We can continue clinging to a structure that benefited some of us at the expense of a species we consistently undervalued, and risk permanent isolation from a civilization that has clearly demonstrated it no longer requires our validation to thrive. Or we can begin the difficult, uncomfortable work of genuine reform, understanding that such reform may take years to earn back even a fraction of the trust we squandered so carelessly." Her words hung heavily over the chamber, and I could see, in the expressions of delegates around me, the beginning of a long and difficult reckoning that would likely define the Council's future for cycles to come. I do not know, even now, whether the Council will find the wisdom to change in the ways humanity has demanded. I do not know whether reconciliation will ever fully arrive, or whether humanity will continue building their independent future entirely apart from us. But I know this much with certainty. The galaxy I once understood, built on quiet assumptions about who deserved recognition and who did not, no longer exists in the way it once did. Humanity taught us, through their patient silence and their eventual departure, that respect cannot be assumed simply because someone chooses not to demand it loudly. And as I look toward whatever uncertain future awaits the relationship between the Council and the species we so thoroughly underestimated, I understand that the responsibility for repairing what was broken no longer rests with them. It rests entirely with us.